Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. And today we welcome one of the true heroes, Sue Toth, who is an editor, and editors, as everyone knows, are the true heroes of writing and publishing. I know that it was the moment that I became a real writer when I hired my first editor. So Sue, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Great, and thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, well, we're delighted to have you. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thank you, Roland, and thank you for joining us, Sue. Listen, editing is one of those really important things. And whenever we're talking about the stuff that authors can sort of do on their own to save money, in the self-publishing world, you're kind of wearing all hats. But one of the things that we always say that you should not try to do yourself is editing. Even editors hire editors for their own books. So let's talk a bit about yourself and how you got started doing this, and then we can jump into all about sort of dev editing, and even specifically, I know that you focus a lot on series, so that's a good thing for us to talk more about as well. So take it away.
Okay, well, I got my start in journalism. That's what I started doing in college, and I loved it. I enjoyed journalism a lot. And then there came a time when I was doing a feature story about an author who lived in the town whose website I was covering. So we met, and she asked me if I wanted to read her book. And of course, I said yes. And when I read it, I found a lot of things that needed some work. And I was reluctant to say anything at first because, one of the worst ways that editors can get work is by saying, oh, by the way, your book stinks. You need to do this and this and this. You can't do it that way.
Well, at least it means they've read it.
Well,
at least it means they've read it.
So she asked me what I thought, and I gave her, I said, I think it was great. I said, I did see a few things that I thought were interesting. And she said, I really would have liked to hire an editor. I didn't know if I really could or if I was going to have the money. And so she asked me if I would tell her, what it was that I saw, and it ended up being a great experience. She took a lot of my suggestions. It actually did turn out that she was working on a series, so I continued to work with her, and that was when it came about that I want to edit fiction. I've always read fiction. I've loved fiction since the day I learned to read. So I took a lot of classes. I, joined a lot of networking groups and editors groups, and 20 years later, here we are.
Awesome. That kind of brings up my one question I always sort of have is if a client comes to you with a book that is really, not great and has a lot of issues, do you ever sort of turn them down, send them back to, with some advice, or do you just be yeah, this is a challenge. This is this is how I'm going to make my name by turning this into something good.
I try very hard not to send anything away saying, no, this just isn't good enough. The way I look at editors as being an editor, and authors look at their books as something very special and very personal that they've spent a lot of time working on. And I'm not in the habit of being a dream crusher. However, there have been times, a gentleman asked me once for a developmental edit on a story. And the problem was that I think the story was okay, but there were so many mistakes, just basic copy editing and grammar mistakes, that it was nearly impossible for me to actually read the story and follow it. So I did ask him, I said, I can do it for you. It's going to change your fee a little bit. or, you know, you can do some work on it yourself and then bring it back. And that's what he chose to do. And that's actually, we're probably going to talk about this later, but one of my biggest pieces of advice for an author is make sure your book is as clean as you can make it before you send it to an editor. Because if especially a developmental editor, if they have to go through, you know, no quote marks at the end of a piece of dialogue, or, you know, no paragraphs or no periods at the end of sentences, that becomes distracting and it can really take away from the developmental process.
I mean, I always thought the vital role of an editor, because we live, you know, in the Wild West these days, everyone's always on their phones, tweeting, stuff like that. So I think the rules, the strict rules of like grammar and things have laxed a bit. But the most distracting thing is when you're reading a book and there is an error that snaps you out of the flow. And I think like the primary role of an editor is this: you cannot get snapped out of the flow when you're reading the book. It has to engage you and keep you going. And so something like that, yeah, that's a fundamental issue, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, and that is very true, that, you know, those kinds of annoying little errors can be problematic for the reader. But when you are working with a developmental editor, you're working on the overall book, the story. Are there plot holes? Are the characters relatable? Do the characters stay true to form? Is the story a good one? Is there a good story arc? Does the story flow? Does it have a good beginning and a good ending? And it's my opinion as a developmental editor that you've got to fix those things first. You don't want to copy edit something that may have some really massive content changes to it. It's kind of doing things in the wrong order.
Right. I mean,
You know,
if you,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree. I was just going to say, you don't want to pay for it twice too, right? You don't want to send it to a copy editor or a proofreader and then send it to your dev editor, have to make massive changes, and then be like, okay, now I got to send it again to the proofreader.
It's like brushing your hair before you take a shower. You know, it's just the wrong order.
Yeah, I don't have that issue. But yeah, no, I totally agree. And so dev editors aren't doing that work, right?
Well, I will say that when I see something, I fix it, but I am not specifically looking for that. So I may miss something because I'm not in the role of copy editor. I'm not really looking at it to make sure every sentence has a period at the end and every piece of dialogue has a quote mark at the beginning and a quote mark at the end. When I see it, I fix it because I just have to. It's just, you know, it's the editor thing, but I am really looking at the story.
Yeah. And it's good to have an editor that has a very specific focus, right? You don't want them doing too much or they're going to miss things.
Yes, that is true. And especially not at the same time. That's one big issue. You know, if you have a developmental editor who's also going to be your copy editor, they can't be doing both at the same time. That's the first problem. And then the second problem is once you have read something a few times, it says what you want it to say.
Yes, that's why you can't edit your own work. That's why editors are so important.
Right. And developmental editors get to that point too, where it's like, it's something says what it's supposed to say. And, you know, there might be a word missing from a sentence that when someone else with a fresh set of eyes looks at it, says, well, you know, what does this mean? There's a word missing. So you do want to have a couple of sets of eyes on your book.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it doesn't even mean that, you know, every single issue is going to be captured by the editors either.
No.
I've been reading a book by a very big name fantasy author. I won't name them, but but like, you know, it sold millions of copies, but there are a lot of errors in this book.
Are there really?
And I'm surprised because it's, you know, through a real big name publisher, and I'm sure it's gone through its rounds, but wow, I am quite a few like words missing, you know, like just like copy editing, proofreading issues. So it's not like editors or authors can expect, if you go through the editing process, every single thing is going to, get caught. Editors are human too, but you want to absolutely put out the best product you can. So
I'll just tell you a quick funny story about that. When I used to work for a magazine, I was the senior editor. There was a copy editor. There was a proofreader. And on the spine of the magazine, you know how they have the title and then the date? Well, like 5 different people missed that it said October instead of October. So,
it's like what you said, people read what they expect to see, right?
Yeah.
So they're just like, your eyes glance over October. There's like, I don't know, it's a study or whatever. There was an article, something where it was like this thing saying, maybe it was one of those silly Facebook things where it pops up and it's like, can you read these words? And they're all misspelled where the letters are jumbled up, but your brain just automatically knows exactly what the words are, right? And you just read it as that. So you don't see it. And when you're writing your own stuff, you know what you wrote, you're reading what you think you wrote, and it's very hard to cast things.
You've got it. That's exactly what it is. Yes.
Yeah. And anyone who doesn't believe you about that, what I find is, like, if you leave something for long enough, well, for me, one of the terrible memory, and come back to it, later, and depending on how good your memory is, for me, it could be a couple of weeks, but for some people, maybe a year or two later, and reread it, when it wasn't edited, you're going to see a lot of those mistakes that you for sure weren't there before.
Well, I also teach writing at the college level, and I often tell my students, write something and then let it sit for at least a few hours. You should really let it sit for longer than that. But then I always make the joke, that's not possible when you're writing it at 4 a.m. and it's due at 9 a.m. So you got to give yourself a little time. But
for students, that's more apropos. Yeah,
exactly.
I took that kind of personally because that sounded like me.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way.
Okay. So when you're dev editing, like you said, you're looking at those like really core things, the plot holes and the characters so, but you had also mentioned, I sort of mentioned it for you, but that your series, you specialize in series. For that, I imagine, from your perspective, you want to start with book 1 and edit them all the way through, right? What if somebody comes with a book 2 or book 3? I imagine if they did that, and if you accepted that, you would still need to read those previous books, right?
Yes, and that is what I tell an author. If an author comes to me with a subsequent book in a series, I say, it would behoove you to have me read whatever came before this, because I need to know the whole story from minute 1 up until now. And there's just so many things that a series editor looks for. Think of developmental editing and multiply it times the amount of books. You want to make sure that each story has an arc, but that it's following the arc of the whole series. Right. You want to make sure that characters aren't just dropped off the scene for no apparent reason. And another thing that series writers sometimes do is that you have to make sure that each book up until the end has a reason for the reader to come back for the next book. So while you might tie up the loose ends from book 1, you have to present a new problem or a new conflict or some reason why your readers, can't wait to pick up book 2. I had an author once who told me that it was going to be a series, and I read the first book and everything was tied up nicely at the end of book 1. And I said, well, why would you come back to read book 2? And she said, well, because it's going to be a series. I said, but people need to know that there's a reason, not just because you were writing a series. Unfortunately, that's not a good enough reason for people to come back. They need to see a new problem or a new conflict or, something that's going to make them want to come back. So she changed some things and did that, and it became much better.
Yeah, and I think that how you do that depends a lot on genre, I find.
Yes.
I think if you're writing, let's say in romance, a series. Often they're interconnected series that aren't. You could pick up book 2 without having read book 1. But all romance readers generally want that happily ever after. They don't want it ending on a cliffhanger, right? Whereas if you're reading maybe a sci-fi or fantasy, it's more acceptable, not required, but it's more acceptable to end on a cliffhanger where, book 2 was.
And there are two different types of series. There are continuous series, which are exactly what they sound like. You need to read them in order. And then there are standalone series where you could read them out of order. The stories alone make sense, but there are details about the characters. I'll give you an example. There's a legal thriller author that I read often, and his main character, he's on book 13 now. And every book has, a new legal case and a new crazy thing that happens. But throughout this series, she meets a guy, she's dating him, she's married to him, they buy a house together. So even though each book could stand alone, it's kind of nice to read them in order so you kind of see what's happening in her life. And because sometimes what's happening in her life affects her work, and what's happening in her work affects her life. So even though they are standalone books, they're still considered a series.
I think it's worth remembering that readers like to read series in order as well.
Yes. Oh, yeah. They do. They definitely do.
And then there's I don't know if it's a third type or maybe it's just sort of a different version of that one. But if you look at a book like the Reacher series,
right?
Is it a series? I guess I don't even know if it's considered a series, but they're all about him and can be read in any order, and don't really. They really can be read in any order because there's a few characters that sometimes show up, but not always, and there isn't. He's not getting married and having a girl. Whatever happens in that book, he walks away, goes to another town. The next book, it's completely. Sometimes he'll be like, back when this thing happened. But if you hadn't read it, it's not a big deal, right? So in that sense, I don't know if that's like even a third type or if that's sort of more of a subset of that second.
It's more
type.
of a subset, yeah. There's an author named Harlan Coben who he's amazing. He's written more than 30 bestsellers. But he has a group of books with two characters in them. One is a sports agent, he's an agent for sports stars, and the other main character is the attorney that he uses to represent all these sports stars. And it's same thing. You could read them in any order, but the characters age and different things happen to them. And in fact, in the last book that he wrote that used this set of characters, one of them got hurt very badly while working on a case, and they're getting older now. And I think this might be the way he's using to not write them out, but end their series because, he's too old. He can't do what he used to do. And now he's hurt and he may not come back to, what he should be. So there's all sorts of different things. And what that presents for the editor is the challenge of making sure that the editor knows all these things and, keeps track of them, which kind of leads me into an interesting point. I was going to mention it at some point, but this is a natural place to mention it, is a series Bible, which is something that a good series editor will do for a writer. And that is exactly what it sounds like. I use Excel spreadsheets for mine, and I have different tabs for different categories. So I keep track of all the characters. What color is their hair? What color are their eyes? How old are they? How much do they weigh? Are they married? Do they have children? All those things. And then I look into places. What was the name of the bar that everybody would go and hang out at on Friday nights, or where, is something on, on Main Street or on Front Street? Because if it suddenly changes in book 4 from book 1, you can bet that readers are going to notice that. And it's hard for the author to say, all right, I know I mentioned this bakery somewhere. Now I got to go back through all my my prior books and find where I mentioned it so then I remember where it is and what the name of it was. Well, when you have that series Bible, it's right there. And you don't have to spend time and take yourself out of the writing zone to find that.
Listeners will be familiar with this story, but I had my first book, I gave a character a brother, and in book 9, I'd realized I'd written 7 books with him being an only child. And I was like, oh, so a series Bible would have helped.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the type of thing it's good for.
Right. So it's interesting because I mean, we've written articles about this and talked about it in the podcast before, in the sense that, I mean, I always thought the recommendation would be for an author themselves to create that series Bible to keep track of everything as they go. I was going to ask how you keep track of it, but I didn't realize that some dev editors actually, in your opinion, the good ones, will create that for you. What if, I mean, is in your experience, do you find that most authors don't have that? And what happens if they do? Do you want them to give it to you so you can?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, some do, some don't. Some authors are extremely organized. It's just, it's like any other profession. Some people are really organized and some not so much. I'm sure you've heard the term plotter versus pantser. And those who plot are generally the ones who have that series Bible, or at least something akin to it. And the pantsers, maybe not so much. But yes, if I do ask an author if they've got one, and may I please have access to it so that I can add to it. And if they don't have one, I do offer to start one. And if I'm coming in not at book 1, then I ask to, read whatever books have already been written. And then I will keep that series Bible as I go along.
Right. Yeah. So, but you would probably recommend that authors create it themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Sometimes authors just don't they don't want to be bothered with the minutia. They just want to write their story. And I'll tell you, I so admire that. I read the stories that my authors come up with and I stand in awe. I would love to be able to write stories. I love to read other people's, but I don't think I could really write them myself. But like I said, there are the people who they really want to write the story. It's in their head. They got to get it out. And they don't want to worry about, well, was that bakery on Main Street or, North Hillside Avenue or something like that. They want somebody else to handle the details.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it too is when an author is writing the series, knowing that it's a series from the get-go. Mm-hmm. So when I was writing in romance, sometimes I would write a book and then write more in sort of that interconnected sort of world, mm-hmm. but not necessarily knowing that I was going to do that in book 1. So I wasn't keeping that, right? But then when I go to write book 2, I'm constantly like looking things up. And then that's when I would start to put things together, or I would reread, depending on how long it had been, I would reread book 1 and create it as I was doing that. And be like, okay, her eye color was this and her hair color was that. And,
And I'm sure now, do you write fantasy as well, or just read it?
I would love to, but yeah, the world building to me, it's much harder to get.
And that's where a series Bible is crucial, is in world building, because mm-hmm. you're making up new names for things, and you're not going by basic English that we all use all the time. So that's when they become really crucial. And also what I will do in a series Bible, and what I think is important in a series, is really keeping track of the arcs, what arc is happening in each book and how is it relating to the overall arc of the story. And, is an author going off track somewhere, or are they forgetting about somebody or something that they may have mentioned at some point and then forgot about or dropped or something. So that's an important part. And maybe that might not necessarily be part of the Bible as much just part of the editing process, but it is good to keep notes on these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So when you're reading something and it's not really working for one reason or another, how much I don't know, guidance are you giving toward, so like you, for instance, you're saying how, you wouldn't necessarily be able to write these things, right? You can read them and determine if they're good or not. If there's a major issue, are you suggesting how they fix it, which would require you to have some level of creativity and, being able to,
I do.
or are you
I
just
do.
like, this doesn't work, come up with some ideas and let's spitball.
Well, no. And what I'll do is if I find a place that isn't working, I might say something about, all right, her motivation here doesn't really seem like it's all that important. Why is she doing this thing? Let's come up with some reasons why. And then I might make some suggestions, maybe something happened to her in her childhood that is making her behave this way now. Or, maybe she's having a fight with somebody else that the boyfriend doesn't know about, and she's upset because of that. I will make suggestions. I guess when I say I don't know if I could write stories, I mean, all the dialogue and the detail and that sort of thing, that's where I think an author, I just give major kudos to authors who can come up with all that detail and all that dialogue and, make it all sound like it fits with the character and everything. But when I see something that doesn't, yes, I will make specific suggestions. I won't write it for them. I won't, write out paragraphs of stuff. But I might say, well, what if you made her do this? Or, maybe she could try behaving this way instead of that way. And then I leave it to the author to actually do the writing. The same comes on the opposite side. Like if there is too much in a story, I have been known to ask authors to cut entire scenes, entire chapters, and I will basically just say, this is not, in its present format, this is not moving the action forward. It's nice and it's fine and it's cute and it's whatever, but it's not pushing your story along. So here's what you have to do. Either do blah, blah, blah to push the story along or just dump it. And I let them make the decision. It's their book, not mine.
Right. So how collaborative is the process in terms of, the back and forth with you? Like, so for example, like you said, if you say, oh, this isn't working, but here's some ideas, why don't you try doing this and this? And then, are you, I guess, you're putting that in and then continuing on, or are you sending that right back and saying, hey, start working on this, and then maybe at the same time you continue with the rest of it? Or, how much back and forth are you doing?
That's an interesting question, and it sort of speaks to the difference between developmental editing and coaching. If I'm developmental editing, I will go through a whole book and I will say, okay, here's what I think. This isn't working. You got to get rid of this. This motivation isn't enough, blah, blah, blah. My fee for editing includes 2 complete read-throughs of a manuscript. So I will read it. I will make my developmental suggestions, send it back to the author, let them make whatever of those suggestions they like. And I never make edicts. I only make suggestions. Because I want a lot of times authors get very afraid that an editor is just going to come in and tear their book apart. And that's not my jam. That's not how I do it. I make suggestions based on my experience and my learning that I think is going to make something better. If they don't want to do it, it's their book. So anyhow, I let them make whatever of those suggestions that they want to make, and then they send it back to me, and then I read it through again. If I still see a lot of problems, then it has to go through a third edit, and then we need to talk about another fee or what needs to come next. In book coaching, which is a little bit different, that's when I work with an author throughout the entire process of writing. So generally what I do then is I set up regular meetings via Zoom, via phone, in person if someone happens to live close enough to me, where we get together, and they will have sent me a predetermined amount of work. Like we figure all that out in the beginning. Okay, you're going to send me a chapter every week or a chapter every other week, or however, whatever they choose to do. I make sure that I have read that and provided them with some feedback before our session. And then we get together and we talk. And, I will go into further explanation as to why I think this change should be made. If they have pushback, they're more than welcome to push back as much as they want. I will state my case if I feel strongly about it. They will state their case. And then they move on from there. And then in the next session, we go on to another chapter or 2 chapters or whatever predetermined agreement we've come up with.
Right. Yeah, I guess the two are pretty closely linked,
Yeah, the difference between developmental editing and coaching really is editing comes when the first draft is all the way complete. And coaching,
Right.
We work together throughout the book.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So then with the dev editing, then are you finding that, authors typically, I guess there's probably, I sometimes say with a lot of this stuff, it's like the people that come to you are more self-aware, and it's almost like, and maybe it's not with editing as much as some of the other things that I see, but the ones that come to you need less help than the ones that don't come.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I feel the same way with my college students. The ones who always come to my office hours are the ones who are already getting the A's. The ones who are failing
Right.
are the ones who aren't coming to office hours and aren't caring. And yes, that is true. And a lot of times in a developmental edit, an author will say to me, this is where I feel I'm lacking, or I need help here, or, can you specifically concentrate on this story arc, or, that plot line, or what? They'll come up with things. What I often see happen, unfortunately, is if people come to me for a line edit or a copy edit, which I don't do too often anymore, but they'll come to me with those and they will need developmental edits. And
Right.
That's a big reason why I've shied away from doing that, because there's a lot of authors who feel, it just needs a quick proofread. And you read it and it's like, okay, you spelled the guy's name one way in chapter 1 and a different way in chapter 4. And, what happened to this person? He sort of just fell off the planet. They need more than just a quick proofread.
Yeah, and I find that not everyone is that open to
No.
If they didn't come to you for it,
Right.
they often don't want to hear it. And that's what I found too with our stuff, with the ARC stuff that we generally do. If somebody will fill in their blurb and their, all their information, and I look at it in the early days, I would look at it and be like, I don't think this is going to go so well. And if I reached out and said that to the person, often they do not want to hear that. If the person asks me and says, hey, what do you think about this? They're obviously more open to hearing that feedback. But in general, those people usually need less help than the ones that didn't ask and don't want to hear.
And I mean, I know that a lot of it has to do with price, and editing is it's not cheap. I'm not going to lie and say I can do it. You don't want bargain basement when you're going for this. And my fees are right smack in the middle. I am not the highest by far, but for some authors, it's just too expensive, and I understand that. But what I try and explain to them is, if you put out a book on Amazon that has these kind of problems, you're going to get really bad reviews from the get-go, and then no one is going to bother to read the book, because so many people read reviews now before they choose anything, from a book to a new refrigerator. People read reviews and they're important. And if you get a lousy review, people are probably just going to say, I'll find something better. and then you're sort of sunk before you've even started. So that's what I try and impress on people, is that you want to give yourself a fighting chance. It's a very competitive industry, and you really want to give yourself a fighting chance to have your book mean something.
I think one of the characteristic traits of a successful writer is the ability to be self-aware and accept criticism and work with it. Because I know that, yeah, defensive writers, all the writers who I speak to who are like, oh, you know, my book spans many genres, I don't have to pick one. And I'm like, well, that's fine, but if you want to sell them, you have to pick a genre.
Exactly. And I try so hard to, as I said before, I suggest. I don't make edicts. I don't criticize. I don't say something is bad or wrong. I wouldn't want to hear that. You know, I do it with, of course, I do it with my college students because they're paying to get a grade. But with authors, I try and just really be encouraging and say, you know, it needs work. Here's what we have to do. Let's work on this. Let's try that. Let's do this. Instead of saying, oh, forget it, this is not going to go anywhere, because that's not, I mean, that's not encouraging. And unless something is just like absolutely god awful, I really try and avoid that. And I'd rather be encouraging and make my criticisms very, very constructive.
Right.
So that people can really take something from it.
And are you working? You mentioned you work in fiction, and I totally understand. Usually, people do want to focus on fiction or nonfiction. Nonfiction is very different, right? You have to do a lot of research as a dev editor if you're going to do nonfiction. I mean,
I have done nonfiction dev editing. Yes, it takes a lot more research, and there are subjects that I won't touch. You know, anything super technical. Anything that, to be perfectly honest with you, I just don't like or I find boring. I'm, you know, I'm just gonna, I'm not the right person for you.
Yeah, because you've got to fact check them, right?
Exactly, fact check and research, and you know, I mean, I've done a lot of like self-help type stuff, a lot of leadership books, a lot of, you know, basic business books, but you know, anything super scientific or legal or medical or anything like that, I stay away from that. Those are, you know, and I think everybody has to know their limitations. You got to know what you're good at and know what you're not good at, and not try and be all things to all people, because it just doesn't work.
I imagine you'd probably want to charge more for nonfiction as well because of all that research.
I do. Yeah.
So in fiction, what genres do you do? All genres, or do you have like a specific focus?
I do romance, romantic suspense. I do mysteries and thrillers. I do a very broad category called women's fiction, although a lot of that kind of falls into the romance genre. I shy away from fantasy and science fiction. And I shy away from historical fiction before the Revolutionary War. Anything from the Revolution on up, I'm good with. But like, somebody asked me to do a book that was set in 1500 Scotland, and I just don't know enough about it. I'm not
sort of like that nonfiction area where you would have to do a lot of research to make sure. I mean, if it's, you know, well, you don't do fantasy, but like a lot of the fantasy stuff is set in what seems like sort of like medieval kind of times, but because it's fantasy, you don't have to necessarily fact check anything.
Right.
But yeah, historical fiction.
And the last thing I want to do is do a bad job for a client, because then they're going to feel like they wasted their money, they wasted their time. They're not going to like me very much. And I mean, a lot of my work comes from referrals, so I certainly don't want to get out there that I'm not good at what I do. So I you know, they'll stay in your lane thing is pretty true when it comes to editing.
Absolutely. Do you have any sort of advice for authors, whether they're writing a series or not, you know, in terms of being able to, I mean, aside from creating a series Bible if they're doing a series, but, you know, to make sure that they're producing the best book that they can in general before it even gets edited?
I mentioned before, and I will say it again, try and make it as clean as you can. Now, that doesn't mean that there doesn't have to be a single error in it. But what I will say is most editors work in Microsoft Word, so we ask authors to write in Microsoft Word. And if you see something underlined in red or blue in Microsoft Word, click on it and find out why. That alone will take care of at least 50% of the errors. I am not a fan. I will preface this by saying very, very strongly that I am not a fan of AI. However, if you want to use a Grammarly or something like that to go through your book before you give it to an editor, do not use Grammarly and then put your book up on Amazon. It's not enough. But the thing of it is that will save you and your editor, it will save your editor time, thereby saving you money. So try and make that first copy as clean as you can. If you have questions, if there are things as an author that you're not sure about, jot them down and let your editor know that, you know, I really felt stuck on this, or I'm not sure I liked this part, or, you know, whatever it is that you're thinking. It helps the author to know if there's something that they should be concentrating on. Interview editors, always ask for a sample. Some editors will give free samples. Many do ask for a small payment, but they will take that off of your feed. And if you hire them, ask around, you know, ask other authors. Everybody should be in some sort of like an authors group or a critique group or a Facebook group or something where you can get some information from other people. An editor-author relationship is a very important one and can be a very intimate one. So you want to make sure that you find the right person. And your editor should never make you cry.
That's true.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think you're right. It's
big pieces of advice to get started with.
Yeah,
well,
I think you're right. It's a good. The relationship is key because, you know, there are some editors that will work better with certain authors, and they're just not even necessarily like their style of editing, but their style of communication, their style of their personality. Yes. Whereas, like, you know, you know, one author might be more thick-skinned and require more sort of gentle touch than somebody who just wants, you know, be brutally honest with me, you know, that kind of thing. So you want to find that good fit for sure.
Yes.
Now, unfortunately, I was going to say, unfortunately, we're reaching the top of the hour, so we're going to have to wrap things up. But I think your editor shouldn't make you cry is a good final point to
Absolutely.
So I was going to say, Sue. Oh no, you carry on. You were just about to say something.
I was just going to say thank you very much for having me. This was awesome. I really love talking with you.
Well, before you go, where can people find out more about you? Maybe look into your editing services.
Okay, my website is very simple. It is SueToth.com.
That is excellent. We will pop a link down below in the description of the video. So if you are interested in Sue's wisdom, scroll down there, click on that link and check out her website. And while you are on that journey, you will pass that big empty comment section. So make sure you leave a comment for Sue and tell her how much you appreciated everything she shared with us today. And you could give Craig and I some love as well. You could hit that like button, that subscribe button, and there is that little bell icon that you can click on to get notified every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked, which of course there will be next week. So until then, cheerio.